paint the different seasons. I paint winter, and I paint spring and summer, but there's my favorite. I just love to paint summer.
For 40 years, Norman Rockwell painted the America of our dreams.
I really believe that the first memories of Rockwell in my life were almost subliminal. They were just a part of what it was like to grow up.
All sunny skies and smiling faces, but he was hiding a brave and dangerous secret. In 1964, he shattered his own perfect image with a painting so truthful, it was met with silence and rejection. Publishers refused to show it. Yet Rockwell painted on, risking the very career that defined him. What he created would crack the veneer of a nation, and finally reveal the real man behind the brush the Norman Rockwell America wasn't ready to see. The boy who drew his way in. Before he became renowned, before he ever thought of painting the America the world wasn't ready to see, there was just Norman, a quiet boy with too many thoughts and not enough words. He was skinny, awkward, and didn't feel like he fit in anywhere, not even really in his own family. His escape, his only real friend, was a pencil and a blank piece of paper. Drawing was a world he could control. While other boys were out playing, Norman was inside, sketching, perfecting, watching the way people talked and moved. He wasn't just drawing faces, he was drawing feelings. This wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession. By the time he was just 14 years old, he made a huge decision. He left high school and enrolled at the Chase School of Fine and Applied Art, now Parsons, the new school for design. After that, he studied full-time at the National Academy of Design before transferring to the Art Students League of New York. Every day, he'd take the train from his family's home in the suburbs into the heart of the city, completely dedicated to learning his craft. He studied under great teachers who taught him more than just how to draw. They taught him how to tell a story with a single image. He learned that an illustration wasn't just a picture. It was a moment frozen in time, filled with emotion and meaning. He realized his gift wasn't for the lofty world of fine art in museums. His gift was for telling stories that regular people could see themselves in. His big break came astonishingly fast. As a teenager, he walked into the office of a new magazine called Boy's Life and landed the job of art editor. He was just a kid, but he was basically in charge of the art for a national magazine. He poured his heart into it, creating hundreds of images for the Boy Scouts that felt so real and adventurous. They made the calendar a nationwide bestseller. But the real thunderclap came in 1916. Norman was 22 years old. He submitted a painting to the most famous magazine in America, the Saturday Evening Post. Titled Mother's Day Off, the painting shows a young boy proudly pushing a baby carriage past two onlookers, their curious stares hinting at the humor of the moment. The playful scene captured everyday life with Rockwell's trademark warmth and wit, earning its place on the cover of the May 20, 1916 issue. That first cover was like a key turning in a lock, opening a door to the entire country. Suddenly, his view of America, the one he'd crafted from his own loneliness and longing, was on newsstands everywhere. The boy who drew his way in had finally arrived, but he had no idea what that fame would eventually cost him. The architect of an American dream. For the next 47 years, Norman Rockwell didn't just paint for the Saturday Evening Post. He and the magazine built a version of America together. It was a cozy, warm, and often hilarious place. He became the most famous illustrator in the country, a household name. This was his America, a place of kindness, humor, and goodwill. It was the America we all wanted to believe in, and America loved him for it. His work was everywhere. During World War II, he was asked to create paintings based on a famous speech by President Franklin Roosevelt. These were the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Rockwell wrestled with the idea of the four freedoms for a long time. He tried many sketches and compositions, but nothing felt right. In his autobiography, he admitted the idea seemed so darn high-blown that he couldn't pin it down. Then one evening he found his answer in an ordinary moment from his Arlington, Vermont life. He remembered his neighbor Jim Edgerton, an outspoken farmer who once stood up at a town meeting to oppose a plan most people supported. The town high school had caught fire in 1940, and the proposal to build a new school needed voter approval. Edgerton, worried about the cost, spoke up and said what he thought. People listened. No one shouted him down. He lost the vote, but he had been heard. To Rockwell, that quiet scene was the perfect picture of freedom of speech. One person speaking their mind and the community giving them a fair hearing. When Rockwell's 4 Freedoms paintings finally appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, the public reaction was huge. The series translates Roosevelt's ideals into everyday scenes. In Freedom of Speech, a plain-spoken Vermont handyman stands and addresses neighbors, showing that ordinary people may speak their minds. Freedom of Worship presents several individuals at prayer, each absorbed in their own faith, celebrating religious diversity. Freedom from Want gathers a family around an abundant Thanksgiving table, its overflowing food suggesting security and relief compared with wartime shortages in Europe. Freedom from Fear closes the set with parents tucking their children into bed, while a newspaper's bomb-blasted headlines hint at dangers elsewhere. The quiet domestic act becomes a claim to safety. The Post received 25,000 requests for reprints in May 1943 alone. The magazine teamed up with the U.S. Treasury to use the paintings for a national war bond campaign. The 4 Freedoms went on tour to 16 cities, seen by about 1.2 million people, and helped sell $133 million in war bonds and stamps, about $1.9 billion in today's money. Everyone who bought a war bond received a set of prints of the 4 Freedoms. The Office of War Information printed 4 million poster sets that read "Buy War Bonds," which were posted in schools, offices, and sent overseas to boost morale. Rockwell opened the tour in Washington with a high-profile event and a state banquet. The next day, he sat on a stage and signed reprints for crowds of people who had bought bonds. The publicity was intense and exhausting, and after the whirlwind of events, he quietly returned to Vermont to recharge. Back in his studio, Rockwell went back to his steady work, painting covers for the Saturday Evening Post and other clients, knowing his 4 Freedoms had helped turn private belief into public action. He kept painting, quietly shaping America's visual memory always. The cracks in the canvas. The world knew Norman Rockwell as the man who painted happiness, but the man himself was crumbling. The pressure to constantly produce these perfect, joyful scenes was a weight he could barely shoulder. He was plagued by deep, lifelong anxieties that laid the foundation for a painting that wasn't ready to see at the time. He was a perfectionist, and the fear that his next painting wouldn't be good enough haunted him. He would sometimes vanish for days, hiding from the world, convinced that everyone would forget about him. His personal life also offered no comfort. His first marriage to Irene O'Connor was lonely and ended in a painful divorce. He later married a schoolteacher named Mary Barstow, and they had 3 sons. They moved to a beautiful old farmhouse in Arlington, Vermont, the very picture of the rustic life he celebrated in his art. But the reality was far messier. The cheerful father in Norman's paintings was a far cry from the man his sons often saw. He was distant, consumed by his work. The art came first, always. He could spend a year on a single magazine cover, leaving his family to tiptoe around the edges of his obsession. The financial strain was real, but the emotional distance was even greater. His son Peter would later say publicly that his father was emotionally absent. The architect of the American family didn't know how to be present on his own. But the deepest crack in his life was his wife, Mary. Her struggle with alcoholism and depression cast a long shadow over their home. The happy Vermont life he painted was a fiction. In reality, Mary's drinking was getting worse. She became a different person when she drank, angry, distant, and unhappy. Norman wrote in his journal about the pain of watching the woman he loved slip away. He felt helpless. The situation became so severe that they made a life-changing decision. In 1953, they moved to the small, picturesque town of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. To outsiders, it seemed like the perfect Rockwellian move, a charming New England town for America's most beloved artist. But the truth was far darker. They didn't move to Stockbridge for the scenery. They moved because it was home to the Austin Riggs Center, a famous psychiatric hospital. Mary needed intensive help and Norman needed it too. His own mind was a prison of worry and fear. It was at Austin Riggs that Norman Rockwell began therapy with a man who would change his life, Dr. Erik Erikson. Erikson was a famous psychoanalyst who had fled Nazi Germany. He was a gentle, brilliant man who helped Norman dig into the roots of his pain, and they found that the roots went deep. Erikson helped him see that all those paintings of perfect, warm, loving families weren't a reflection of his own life. They were a desperate, beautiful wish. They were the family he never had. Norman's own childhood had been lonely. He felt his mother was cold and distant. He never felt like he belonged. So on his canvas, he created the world he longed for, a world where everyone was included, where mothers were kind, and where fathers were present. This was a staggering revelation. His art wasn't just a job, it was his therapy. Every happy scene was an attempt to heal a childhood wound. Erikson gave him the strength to see that his own feelings, his anxiety, his sadness, his sense of being an outsider, were not weaknesses. They were a source of truth. And then in the middle of this painful self-discovery, tragedy struck. In 1959, Mary died suddenly of a heart attack. Norman was shattered. The grief was overwhelming. For the first time, he tried to paint what he truly felt. The sadness, the loss, the emptiness. But the magazines didn't want it. They rejected the darker, more emotional pieces. They still wanted the joy. It was a cruel contradiction. He was told to paint happiness while living in despair. His Dr. Erikson supposedly told him a heartbreaking truth. You paint your happiness, but you don't live it. Those words cut him to the bone. He had spent decades building a dream for America, but he was living a nightmare. And as the 1960s dawned, with the nation erupting in a fierce struggle for civil rights, something in him began to shift. The therapy had given him a new voice. The pain of his own life had given him a new empathy. He was no longer satisfied with painting a perfect lie. For the first time in his long career, Norman Rockwell felt a powerful, urgent need to paint the truth, no matter the cost. Breaking the golden handcuffs. For 47 years, Norman Rockwell and the Saturday Evening Post were like a married couple. It was the most famous partnership in American publishing. He had given them 323 covers. They had given him a vast audience and a comfortable life. But by 1963, the marriage was over. The world had changed dramatically. The calm, cozy 1950s were gone. The nation was now in the thick of the civil rights movement, with passionate protests and painful struggles for equality playing out on television screens every night. And Norman Rockwell had changed too. The years of therapy had opened his eyes. He could no longer ignore the gap between the perfect America he was paid to paint and the real, often divided America he saw outside his window. He felt a deep restlessness. He was tired of the rules. The biggest, most unbreakable rule at the Post was about race. He was not allowed to paint African Americans as the main subjects in his pictures. If they appeared at all, it was in the background, as servants or laborers. The magazine's editors were afraid of offending their readers, especially in the South. For a man who now understood his own loneliness and longing to belong, this rule felt like a lie. He was painting a world that deliberately left people out. He later said, "I portrayed the best of all possible worlds. That kind of stuff is dead now." He knew it, and he knew he had to be a part of the new, real world. So, at the age of 69, when most people are settling into a quiet retirement, Norman Rockwell made the bravest decision of his career. He walked away from the Saturday Evening Post. His last cover was a solemn, respectful portrait of a grieving President John F. Kennedy, who had just been assassinated. It was a fitting end, a painting that acknowledged national pain, not just simple joy. He didn't retire. Instead, he went to a different magazine, a magazine known for tackling social issues head-on. He went to Look. This was like an artist switching from painting pretty postcards to writing hard-hitting news articles. At Look, they gave him the freedom he craved. He could finally paint about the things that kept him up at night: civil rights, poverty, and injustice. He was finally free to tell the truth as he saw it. But freedom came with a cost. Almost immediately, the hate mail started pouring in. Former fans called him a race traitor. Some letters contained violent threats warning him to stop. The comfortable, beloved illustrator was now a controversial figure. The golden handcuffs were off, and his hands were shaking. But his brush was steady. He was ready to paint the picture that would change everything. The problem we all live with. Now that he was free, Norman Rockwell faced a question he had never truly been allowed to ask before. What story did he need to tell? The answer was all over the news. It was in the brave faces of young black students walking into schools, facing screaming mobs just for getting an education. It was in the struggle for basic dignity and equality. This was the real America, and he felt a powerful, urgent need to bear witness. His mind went back to something that had happened a few years earlier, in 1960s. A 6-year-old black girl named Ruby Bridges, dressed in a crisp white dress and hair ribbons, had to be escorted by 4 towering U.S. federal marshals into an all-white elementary school in New Orleans. An angry crowd surrounded her every day, shouting horrible things. She was brave and quiet, a single small figure walking through a storm of hate. That image stuck with Rockwell. He knew that was the story. He would paint Ruby's walk. But he wouldn't paint the screaming mob directly. That was the genius of it. He put you, the viewer, right there on the sidewalk. You are part of the crowd. You are looking at this tiny, dignified child as she walks past a wall that has been vandalized with a cruel, racist word and the splattered red juice of a thrown tomato. The marshals are tall and protective, but we can't see their faces. All the focus is on Ruby. She is just a little girl, carrying her school supplies, doing something that should be simple and happy: going to school. He worked with a fierce focus, using a little girl from his neighborhood as his model. He poured all of his skill, all of the emotion he had once used for happy family scenes, into this one powerful image. He called it the problem we all live with. He wasn't pointing a finger at just the people in the South. The title said it all. This was a problem for everyone. This was America's problem. When the painting appeared in Look magazine in January of 1964, it was like a bomb going off in living rooms across the country. People were not used to seeing Norman Rockwell like this. This wasn't warm or funny. It was raw, uncomfortable, and real. The backlash was immediate and furious. Thousands of people canceled their subscriptions to Look. The hate mail that had been trickling in now became a flood. People called Rockwell a communist and a race traitor. They said he had betrayed America. They accused him of creating hate instead of the harmony he was famous for. For many white Americans, especially those who saw his work as a comfort, this painting was a brutal accusation. It forced them to look at an ugliness they could previously ignore. But for others, especially Black Americans and those involved in the civil rights movement, the painting was a revelation. Finally, someone with a massive public platform was showing their reality. Finally, their struggle was being treated with the same seriousness and artistic power as his Thanksgiving turkeys and doctor's visits. He wasn't just painting about them. He was painting for them, honoring their courage. Rockwell was shaken by the anger, but he was not sorry. He knew he had done the right thing. This painting was the culmination of his entire journey. The lonely boy, the constrained artist, the man in therapy, the grieving husband. All of it came together to give him the courage to paint this. A conscience in paint. After the firestorm around Ruby Bridges, Norman Rockwell could have stepped back. He was in his late 60s. He had already secured his place in history. But the hate mail and the canceled subscriptions didn't scare him off. If anything, they convinced him he was on the right path. He had found his voice, and he was going to use it. Just a few months after The Problem We All Live With was published, another terrible event shook the nation. In the summer of 1964, 3 young civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi. They had been helping black citizens register to vote. The brutality of the crime and the fact that local law enforcement was involved horrified the country. It also horrified Norman Rockwell. He couldn't get the story out of his head. He had nightmares about it. He decided his next painting for Look would confront this evil directly. He called it Murder in Mississippi. It showed the final, desperate moments of the 3 young men. The scene is dark, lit by the harsh glow of a flashlight and a car's headlights. One worker is on the ground, while another tries to help him, looking up at the unseen killers whose shadows loom over them like ghosts. It was a painful, difficult painting to look at. He worked on nothing else for 5 weeks, completely consumed by the need to tell this story. It was the opposite of everything he was famous for. There was no hope, no humor, only a stark depiction of a racist crime. Not every painting was so dark. In 1967, he painted New Kids in the Neighborhood. This one was quieter, but just as powerful. It shows a moving van in a suburban neighborhood. 2 black children stand facing 2 white children. They are just looking at each other, curious and a little cautious. A baseball glove and a cat hint at the common ground they might find. This painting wasn't about violent hatred. It was about the nervous, everyday moment of integration. It was about the hope and the tension of a changing America, right there on a sunny sidewalk. This new chapter of his career forced everyone to see Norman Rockwell differently. For years, serious art critics had looked down their noses at his work. They called him a mere illustrator, not a real artist. They said his work was too sweet, too sentimental, and out of touch with the modern world. But now those very same critics had to pay attention. Here was Rockwell, no longer painting a perfect fantasy, but holding up a mirror to the nation's deepest problems. He was using the same incredible skill he always had, his genius for telling a story in a single frame. But now he was telling stories that mattered in a new way. He was finally being recognized not just as a talented commercial artist, but as a serious painter with a social conscience. This period also made him look back on his own past work with regret. He thought about the way he had drawn black people earlier in his career, like in his illustrations for Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. He realized he had often relied on stereotypes, drawing them as simple-minded or servile, because that's what was expected at the time. He felt ashamed of it. In his 70s, he was actively trying to make up for those mistakes. He met with civil rights leaders to make sure his new paintings were respectful and accurate. He wasn't trying to be a white savior. He was trying to be an ally, using his platform to amplify the struggle for justice. The man who had spent decades painting an America that didn't really exist was now tirelessly painting the America that was. He was tired, and the work was emotionally draining, but he had never felt more certain about what he was doing. For the first time, Norman Rockwell wasn't just painting for a paycheck or for fame. He was painting for his country's soul. The man behind the mirror. So who was the real Norman Rockwell? Was he the man who painted our brightest dreams or the one who forced us to see our hardest truths? The answer is, he was both. He was a man forever caught between the world he wished for and the world he lived in. In 1977, the nation officially recognized its most beloved artist. President Gerald Ford awarded Norman Rockwell the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honor a civilian can receive. But Rockwell was too sick and frail to travel to Washington. His son Jarvis accepted the award for him. It was a final, quiet irony. The man who had defined the American experience for millions was too unwell to receive his country's thanks in person. He died a year later in 1978, at the age of 84. And when people went through his affairs, they found a clue that told a story his paintings never could. He had left behind roughly $50,000 in unpaid therapy bills. That's about $200,000 today. For decades, he had been quietly battling his demons, the anxiety, the depression, the deep-seated insecurity, with the help of his psychoanalyst. Even at the end, the man behind the sunny mirror was wrestling with his own mind. After his death, the questions about his art and his life only grew more complex. In 2013, a biographer made shocking claims, suggesting Rockwell had hidden a trove of erotic drawings and struggled with repressed desires. His family fiercely denied it, saying it was a gross misunderstanding of the man they knew. The truth, as always with Rockwell, seems to lie somewhere in the shadows, reminding us that no one is as simple as they seem. Then, there was the mystery of the missing paintings. Years after his death, a stunning discovery was made. An illustrator named Donald Trachte had owned one of Rockwell's most famous works, Breaking Home Ties. But when experts examined it, they realized it was a nearly perfect copy. The real painting was discovered hidden behind a false wall in Trachte's home. He had likely hidden it during a bitter divorce. When the original was finally auctioned in 2006, it sold for $15.4 million. The discovery made people wonder, how many other originals were out there, hidden away, their true stories waiting to be told? It was the perfect metaphor for Rockwell's own life. For so long, the public saw only the copy, the cheerful, uncomplicated artist. The real man, with all his pain, doubt, and late-found courage, was hidden behind a wall, only to be discovered later. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.